Captain Sarah Chun adjusted her flight suit for the third time that morning as she walked across the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base. The California desert sun beat down mercilessly, creating heat waves that danced across the concrete runway. Her F-16 Fighting Falcon sat waiting, its sleek gray body gleaming under the harsh light. Another training run, she muttered to herself, checking her watch. In 30 minutes, she would be airborne again, practicing the same maneuvers she had mastered years ago. The routine had become almost mechanical. Take off, fly the designated pattern, practice engagement scenarios against computer-simulated targets, land, debrief, repeat. Sarah had been flying for the Air Force for 8 years now. She had graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy and excelled in every training program they threw at her. Her instructors consistently rated her as exceptional. Her reaction times were faster than most of her male counterparts. Her spatial awareness was outstanding. Her ability to think under pressure was remarkable. Yet here, she was still flying training missions while her male classmates from the academy were deployed overseas, seeing real action in combat zones. The official policy had changed recently, allowing women in combat roles, but the implementation moved at the speed of bureaucracy. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of a transitional period where the rules said one thing, but the culture moved much slower. "Chun, you ready for another thrilling day of pretend combat?" called out Lieutenant Mike Rodriguez as he jogged up beside her. Mike had been her wingman during training exercises for the past 2 years. He was a good pilot and a decent guy, but Sarah could hear the frustration in his voice that mirrored her own. "About as ready as I can be for another day of simulated everything," Sarah replied, pulling on her helmet. "Sometimes I wonder if we're training to be pilots or video game players." Mike laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Tell me about it." "My brother's flying missions over Afghanistan right now. Real missions, real targets, real consequences. Meanwhile, we're here playing laser tag at 30,000 feet. They walked together toward their aircraft. Sarah's F-16 bore her call sign, Phoenix, painted in small letters below the cockpit. She had earned that name during a particularly difficult training exercise when her aircraft suffered multiple system failures, but she managed to bring it home safely and land without incident. Her instructor said she had risen from the ashes of certain disaster like a phoenix. The pre-flight check took 20 minutes. Sarah went through every system methodically. Fuel levels, hydraulics, electrical systems, weapons systems, communications, navigation equipment. Everything had to be perfect. In training, a mistake might cost points on evaluation. In real combat, mistakes cost lives. "Phoenix, this is Control Tower. You are cleared for takeoff on runway 27. Weather conditions are optimal. Visibility unlimited. Windcom. Control Tower, this is Phoenix. Cleared for takeoff, runway 27. Copy conditions." Sarah advanced the throttles slowly, feeling the powerful engine behind her come to life. The F-16 was a beautiful machine, designed for one purpose: air-to-air combat. It could accelerate from 0 to over 400 miles per hour in seconds. It could climb at rates that would make passenger jet pilots dizzy. It could turn so sharply that the G-forces could knock a pilot unconscious if they were not properly conditioned. The aircraft rolled down the runway, gathering speed. Sarah pulled back on the stick, and the nose lifted. Seconds later, she was airborne, climbing rapidly into the clear blue Nevada sky. The feeling never got old. No matter how many times she flew, the moment of takeoff still gave her a rush of excitement. "Phoenix, this is Eagle Base. Proceed to training area, Charlie 7. Today's exercise involves multiple bogies approaching from the northeast. Your mission is to intercept and engage using simulated weapons. Rules of engagement are weapons-free on all targets identified as hostile. Eagle Base, Phoenix copies. Proceeding to Charlie 7 for intercept mission." Sarah banked the aircraft to the northeast and climbed to 25,000 feet. The training area was a vast expanse of empty desert where pilots could practice without worrying about civilian air traffic or populated areas below. It was perfect for combat training, except that nothing they did here was real. The radar screen in front of her began showing contacts. for aircraft approaching from the north at high speed. According to the exercise parameters, these were enemy fighters attempting to penetrate American airspace. Sarah's job was to stop them. Phoenix's contact for bogeys bearing 015, range 40 miles, closing fast. Phoenix cleared to engage. Take them down. Sarah turned toward the approaching aircraft and increased speed. Her radar locked onto the lead target. In a real combat situation, she would fire an AIM-120 AMRAAM missile at this range. The missile would guide itself to the target using its own radar, giving her a high probability of kill from beyond visual range. Instead, she pressed the simulated weapons release button. The computer system recorded a successful missile launch and calculated that her target had been destroyed. The exercise controllers would inform the opposing pilot that he had been killed and should return to base. Phoenix Splash 1. 3 bogeys remaining. The remaining enemy aircraft continued their approach. Sarah selected her second target and repeated the process. Another simulated missile launch, another calculated kill. But the last 2 aircraft were now close enough to engage her with their own simulated weapons. Sarah threw her F-16 into a sharp banking turn, pulling nearly 7 Gs. The force pressed her down into her seat, making her feel as if she weighed 7 times her normal weight. Her vision began to gray around the edges as the blood was forced away from her brain. This was where years of physical conditioning and G-force training paid off. Many pilots would have blacked out completely under this stress. She rolled inverted and pulled the nose toward the ground, diving to gain speed and change the geometry of the engagement. One of the enemy pilots tried to follow her down, but Sarah had anticipated this move. As the hostile aircraft committed to the dive, she pulled hard on the stick, bringing her nose back up and positioning herself behind her opponent. Fox 2, she called out, indicating a simulated heat-seeking missile launch. The infrared seeker would home in on the hot exhaust of the enemy aircraft's engine. At this close range, it was nearly impossible to avoid. Phoenix Splash 3. 1 bogey remaining. The final enemy aircraft was closing fast from her left side. Sarah could see the F-16 now, painted in the aggressor squadron's distinctive desert camouflage pattern. The pilot was good, positioning his aircraft for a gun's attack. In a few seconds, he would be in range to use his 20mm cannon. Sarah waited until the last possible moment, then pulled straight up into a vertical climb. The enemy pilot tried to follow, but Sarah had timed the maneuver perfectly. His aircraft could not match her rate of climb from this position. As he fell behind and below her, Sarah rolled over and dove down on him from above. Guns, 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 she called out, indicating a cannon attack. The exercise computer calculated the ballistic path of her simulated bullets and determined that several would have struck the enemy aircraft. Phoenix Splash 4. All bogeys destroyed. Return to base for debriefing. Phoenix copies. Returning to base. The flight back to Edwards took 15 minutes. Sarah used the time to think about the engagement. She had performed well, destroying all 4 enemy aircraft without taking any damage herself. Her tactics had been sound, her flying precise, her decision-making quick and accurate. But it had all been pretend. Computer simulations and radio calls. No real missiles had been fired. No real aircraft had been destroyed. No real pilots had been in danger. It was elaborate theater designed to train pilots for situations they might never actually face. After landing and shutting down the aircraft, Sarah walked to the debriefing room. The exercise controllers had recorded every aspect of the training mission. They would analyze her performance in detail, looking for areas where she could improve. The feedback would be thorough and professional. Colonel James Mitchell ran the debriefing session. He was an experienced combat pilot who had flown missions in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Unlike Sarah, he had seen real combat. He had fired real weapons at real enemies. He had felt the weight of life and death decisions in actual combat situations. Outstanding flying today, Captain Chun, Colonel Mitchell began. Your intercept geometry was textbook perfect. Your timing on the vertical maneuver was excellent. Your overall situational awareness throughout the engagement was exceptional. Sarah nodded politely. She appreciated the positive feedback, but she knew that exceptional performance in training did not necessarily translate to success in real combat. Training could simulate many aspects of air-to-air combat, but it could not replicate the psychological pressure of knowing that real lives were at stake. Sir, when will pilots like myself get the opportunity to deploy to active combat zones? Sarah asked. I understand that policy has changed to allow women in combat roles, but we seem to still be limited to training missions. Colonel Mitchell paused before answering. Sarah could see him choosing his words carefully. The transition is happening gradually, Captain. The Pentagon wants to ensure that all personnel are properly prepared before deployment. Combat is different from training in ways that are difficult to explain. With respect, sir, how can we ever be properly prepared if we never get the opportunity to gain real experience? That's a fair question, Captain. The answer is that decisions about deployment assignments are made well above my pay grade. What I can tell you is that your training performance puts you in the top 5% of all pilots in your class. When deployment opportunities become available, you'll be among the first to be considered. Sarah left the debriefing room feeling frustrated. She understood the colonel's position. He was a middle manager in a large military bureaucracy. He could not unilaterally change deployment policies. But that understanding did not make her situation any less frustrating. The next few weeks followed the same pattern. Training flights, simulated combat exercises, debriefing sessions, and more training flights. Sarah continued to excel in every measurable category. Her flying skills were sharp. Her tactical knowledge was comprehensive. Her physical conditioning was excellent. But she was growing restless. She had joined the Air Force to serve her country, not to spend years practicing for service she might never actually perform. The gap between her capabilities and her opportunities was becoming increasingly difficult to accept. One evening, Sarah sat in the officers' club with several other pilots. The conversation inevitably turned to deployment assignments and combat experience. Lieutenant Rodriguez had just received orders for Afghanistan. Captain Williams was heading to Syria. Even Lieutenant Jackson, who had graduated from pilot training 6 months after Sarah, was being sent to Kuwait. It's not personal, Sarah, Captain Williams said, trying to be supportive. The system is just slow to change. Give it time. Time for what? Sarah replied. Time for the wars to end? Time for me to age out of combat eligible status? Time for my skills to deteriorate from lack of real-world application. Look at it this way, Lieutenant Jackson offered. You're getting more training than any of us. When you finally do deploy, you'll be incredibly well prepared. Sarah appreciated her colleagues' attempts to make her feel better, but their words rang hollow. More training was not what she needed. She needed the opportunity to use her skills in the real situations for which she had trained. The irony was not lost on her. The military had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars training her to be a combat pilot. She had mastered every skill they had taught her. She had exceeded every standard they had set. Yet the same institution that had invested so much in her development seemed reluctant to actually employ her in the role for which she had been trained. Late that night, Sarah stood on the balcony of her quarters, looking up at the stars. Somewhere above those stars, satellites were transmitting communications from combat zones around the world. Pilots who were no more qualified than she were flying real missions, making real differences in real conflicts. She thought about her father, who had flown F-4 Phantoms during the Vietnam War. He had been shot down over North Vietnam and spent 3 years in a prisoner of war camp. When he returned home, he never spoke much about his experiences, but Sarah could see the weight of them in his eyes. Her father had sacrificed for his country in ways that Sarah could barely imagine. He had endured hardships that she hoped she would never have to face. But he had also served with purpose and meaning. His missions had mattered. His skills had been tested in the crucible of real combat. Sarah wanted that same sense of purpose. She wanted to know that her training and abilities were being used to make a real difference. She wanted to test herself against the challenges that only real combat could provide. As she stood there in the cool desert air, Sarah made a decision. She would continue to excel in training, but she would also be more aggressive in pursuing deployment opportunities. She would speak with her commanding officers. She would volunteer for every overseas assignment. She would make it impossible for the system to ignore her qualifications and her desire to serve. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Colonel Mitchell called an urgent meeting for all squadron pilots. As they gathered in the briefing room, Sarah could sense that something significant was happening. The colonel's expression was more serious than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received word from the Pentagon. Intelligence reports indicate that terrorist organizations have acquired several advanced surface-to-air missile systems. These systems pose a significant threat to our aircraft operating in multiple theaters. As a result, the Air Force is accelerating deployment schedules and expanding the pool of pilots eligible for overseas assignments." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This could be the opportunity she had been waiting for. "Captain Chun," Colonel Mitchell continued, looking directly at her, "your training scores and overall readiness ratings put you at the top of the list for immediate deployment consideration. Are you prepared to accept an overseas assignment with minimal notice?" "Absolutely, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Good. You'll receive detailed orders within the next 48 hours. I can tell you now that you'll be deploying to a forward operating base in the Middle East. Your mission will involve both air-to-air and air-to-ground operations in support of coalition forces." As the meeting concluded, Sarah realized that her period of waiting was finally coming to an end. Soon she would leave the safety and predictability of training exercises behind. She would enter a world where the stakes were real, where her decisions could mean the difference between life and death for herself and others. The training was over. The real test was about to begin. The transport plane's engines droned steadily as Captain Sarachin stared out the small window at the endless expanse of desert below. After 18 hours of flying, she was finally approaching Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The reality of deployment was setting in. No more training exercises. No more simulated combat. Everything from this point forward would be real. Beside her sat Major Tom Bradley, an experienced combat pilot who would serve as her squadron commander. Bradley had flown over 200 combat missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. His weathered face and quiet demeanor spoke of someone who had seen enough action to last several lifetimes. "First deployment?" Bradley asked, noticing Sarah's intense focus on the landscape below. "Yes, sir. Looking forward to finally putting all that training to use." Bradley nodded slowly. "Training's important, but combat teaches you things no simulator can. The most important lesson is that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Flexibility and quick thinking matter more than perfect execution of textbook maneuvers." The aircraft began its descent toward Al Udeid. Sarah could see the sprawling military base growing larger through the window. Rows of aircraft lined the tarmac. F-16s, F-15s, A-10s, and various support aircraft. This was a serious operation, supporting multiple combat theaters across the Middle East. After landing, Sarah gathered her gear and followed Bradley through the arrival process. The heat hit her immediately as they stepped off the air-conditioned plane. Even though it was evening, the temperature was still over 90 degrees. The air was dry and dusty, carrying the smell of jet fuel and desert sand. "Welcome to the sandbox," Bradley said with a wry smile. "You'll get used to the heat. Everything else takes longer to adjust to." The base briefing took place the next morning. Sarah sat with 15 other pilots in a windowless room, listening to intelligence officers describe the current situation in the region. The briefing was classified, but the general picture was clear. Enemy forces had become more sophisticated and more dangerous. Terrorist organizations have acquired at least 12 S-20 surface-to-air missile systems, explained Captain Jennifer Walsh, the intelligence officer. "These are Russian-made systems, much more advanced than anything we've seen in this region before. They have a range of over 100 miles and can engage multiple targets simultaneously." Sarah studied the photographs on the briefing screen. The missile systems looked impressive and threatening. Each launcher carried 4 large missiles that could reach aircraft flying at altitudes up to 80,000 feet. "How do they get these systems?" asked Lieutenant Colonel Davis, the wing commander. "Intelligence suggests they were provided by a state sponsor, but We don't have definitive proof. What matters for our operations is that these systems are deployed in multiple locations and pose a serious threat to all coalition aircraft. Captain Walsh clicked to the next slide, showing a map of the region with red circles marking suspected missile sites. Your mission priorities have changed. Previously, we focused primarily on close air support for ground forces. Now, your primary mission will be suppressing these air defense systems. We call it SEAD, Suppression of Enemy Air Defense. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. SEAD missions were among the most dangerous types of combat flying. Pilots had to fly directly toward the most heavily defended enemy positions, often using themselves as bait to force the enemy to turn on their radar systems so that anti-radiation missiles could lock onto and destroy them. What's our timeline? Bradley asked. First SEAD mission launches tomorrow at 0800 hours. Captain Shun, you'll be flying wingman for Major Bradley. This will be your introduction to combat operations. After the briefing, Sarah spent the rest of the day preparing for her first combat mission. She studied target folders, memorized threat locations, and reviewed emergency procedures. The preparation was similar to what she had done for countless training missions, but the psychological weight was completely different. That evening, she called her parents from the base communication center. Her father answered on the second ring. Dad, I'm calling from overseas. Can't say exactly where, but I'm safe and settling in well. Good to hear your voice, sweetheart. How are you feeling about everything? Sarah could hear the concern in her father's voice. As a former combat pilot himself, he understood better than most what she was about to face. I'm ready, Dad. All that training is finally going to pay off. Remember what I taught you. Trust your instincts, stay focused, and never let your guard down. The enemy only has to get lucky once. You have to be perfect every time. I will, Dad. I love you. Love you too, Sarah. Make us proud. The conversation with her father helped settle her nerves. She had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Now it was time to prove that all the training, all the waiting, and all the frustration had been worthwhile. Sarah woke up at 0500 hours the next morning. Her first combat mission was scheduled for 0800, which meant pre-flight briefing at 0630. She had slept poorly, her mind running through various scenarios and contingencies. Every pilot experienced pre-mission jitters, but she was determined not to let nervousness affect her performance. The mission briefing was more detailed than any training exercise she had ever attended. Major Bradley used satellite photographs and intelligence reports to walk through every aspect of the planned operation. Our target is a suspected SA-20 site approximately 100 miles northeast of here. Intelligence believes there are at least 2 launchers at this location, along with associated radar and command vehicles. Our job is to destroy or disable the entire system. Sarah studied the target photographs. The missile site was located in a valley surrounded by low hills. The terrain would make approach and escape more challenging, but it also provided some protection from other missile sites in the area. What's our ingress route? She asked. We'll approach from the southwest, using these hills for terrain masking. The plan is to stay below radar coverage until we're within 15 miles of the target. Then pop up and engage with AGM-88 HAR missiles. The AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile was designed specifically for SEAD missions. It could detect enemy radar emissions from long range and guide itself to the source of those emissions. The missile was fast and accurate, but it required the enemy to turn on their radar systems in order to work. What if they don't turn on their radars? Sarah asked. Then, we use a different approach. We carry cluster bombs as a backup. If the HAR missiles can't lock onto radar emissions, we'll make low-level bombing runs on the suspected launcher positions. Low-level bombing runs were much more dangerous than standoff missile attacks. Flying low and slow over heavily defended targets exposed aircraft to all types of enemy weapons, from advanced missiles down to small arms fire. Time to target is 45 minutes, Bradley continued. We'll be operating under radio silence until we reach the initial point. After that, We follow standard SEAD procedures. Any questions? Sarah had dozens of questions, but she knew that most of them could only be answered through experience. No, sir. Ready to go. At 0800 hours, Sarah walked out to her F-16 for her first combat mission. The aircraft had been loaded with 2 AGM-88 missiles, 1 cluster bomb, a full load of 20mm ammunition, and maximum fuel. It was the heaviest weapons load she had ever carried. The pre-flight inspection took longer than usual. In combat, aircraft reliability was literally a matter of life and death. Sarah checked every system twice, looking for any sign of malfunction or damage. Everything appeared to be in perfect working order. "Phoenix, you ready?" Bradley called over the radio from his aircraft parked nearby. "Phoenix ready," Sarah replied, starting her engine. The takeoff was routine, but as soon as they became airborne, Sarah realized that everything was different. This was not a training exercise. The weapons beneath her wings were real. The target they were flying toward contained real enemies who would try to kill her if given the opportunity. They flew in formation toward the target area, maintaining radio silence as planned. Sarah used the flight time to review her target materials one more time and to run through various contingency scenarios in her mind. What would she do if they encountered unexpected enemy aircraft? How would she react if her aircraft suffered battle damage? What was her backup plan if the primary target was not where intelligence said it would be? 30 minutes into the flight, they reached the initial point where they would begin their attack approach. Bradley's voice came through her headset for the first time since takeoff. "Phoenix, Hawk Leader. Beginning attack profile. Stay close and follow my lead." Phoenix copies. They descended to low altitude and began following the planned route through the hills. Flying at high speed, only a few hundred feet above the ground required intense concentration. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. A momentary lapse in attention could result in controlled flight into terrain. Sarah could see Bradley's aircraft ahead of her, weaving through the valleys and ridges with practiced precision. She matched his movements exactly, maintaining position while scanning for threats. So far, everything was proceeding according to plan. Phoenix, Hawk Leader. Target area in sight. Climbing to attack altitude. Sarah followed Bradley as he pulled up sharply and climbed above the surrounding hills. For the first time, she could see their target clearly. The missile site was exactly where intelligence had said it would be. 2 large vehicles that appeared to be SA-20 launchers were positioned in the center of a small cleared area. Several smaller vehicles were scattered around the perimeter. Hawk Leader has radar contact. SA-20 system is active. Weapons free. Bradley fired his first HARM missile. Sarah could see the white contrail as the missile streaked toward the target at over twice the speed of sound. She selected her own HARM missile and waited for her radar warning receiver to detect enemy emissions. The warning tone sounded immediately. Enemy radar was painting her aircraft, trying to establish a firing solution. This was exactly what they wanted. The HARM missile needed those radar emissions to guide to its target. "Phoenix, Fox 1, she called, firing her anti-radiation missile. Both missiles struck their targets within seconds of each other. Large explosions erupted from the missile site as radar antennas and control vehicles were destroyed. But the mission was not complete. The actual missile launchers appeared to still be intact. "Phoenix, Hawk Leader. Continuing attack with cluster bombs. Follow me in." Bradley rolled his aircraft into a steep dive toward the missile site. Sarah followed, diving toward the target at over 400 miles per hour. At this speed and altitude, they would be vulnerable to any remaining enemy defenses. As they approached the target, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from small arms fire. Enemy personnel were shooting at them with rifles and machine guns. The bullets could not reach their altitude, but they served as a reminder that real people below were trying to kill them. Bradley released his cluster bomb at the planned release point and immediately pulled up in a sharp climbing turn. Sarah followed the same profile, releasing her weapon and pulling up hard to avoid flying through the blast area. The cluster bomb exploded above the target, releasing hundreds of smaller bomblets that peppered the area below. When the smoke cleared, Both missile launchers appeared to be damaged beyond repair. Hawk Leader Phoenix. Target destroyed. Egressing to the south. Phoenix copies. Good work. The flight back to base was surreal. Sarah could barely believe that she had just completed her first combat mission. She had fired real weapons at real targets. She had been shot at by real enemies. The transition from training to combat had happened so quickly that she was still processing the experience. During the post-mission debriefing, gun camera footage showed that both missiles had hit their intended targets. The intelligence section confirmed that satellite imagery showed the missile site was completely destroyed. The mission had been a complete success. Outstanding work for a first combat mission, Bradley told her afterward. You stayed calm under pressure and executed everything perfectly. That's not easy when people are shooting at you for the first time. Thank you, sir. When is our next mission? Bradley smiled. Tomorrow morning. We've got 3 more suspected SA-20 sites to hit this week. Welcome to combat flying, Phoenix. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about the day's events. She had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer a pilot in training. She was a combat veteran. The change felt both significant and surprisingly subtle. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah flew 8 more SCAD missions. Each one was similar to the first in terms of planning and execution, but the cumulative effect was transformative. She gained confidence in her abilities and developed the instinctive responses that only came through actual combat experience. The missions were successful, but they were also taking a toll. Flying repeatedly into heavily defended airspace was mentally and physically exhausting. Every mission carried the possibility of aircraft loss and pilot death. Several other squadrons had already lost aircraft to the sophisticated enemy defenses. The enemy is adapting, Captain Walsh explained during one of the daily intelligence briefings. They're learning our tactics and adjusting their defensive strategies. Some of the newer SA-20 sites are being positioned differently, making them harder to attack. Sarah could see the concern in Bradley's face. As an experienced combat pilot, he understood that warfare was a constant cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation. Every tactical advantage was temporary. Success required continuous innovation and evolution. What are our options? Lieutenant Colonel Davis asked. We're working on new attack profiles and weapons employment techniques. But the bottom line is that these missions are going to get more dangerous before they get easier. After the briefing, Sarah approached Bradley privately. Sir, what's your honest assessment of our situation? Bradley looked around to make sure they could not be overheard. Honestly, we're in a dangerous position. The enemy has better equipment than we expected, and they're using it more effectively than intelligence predicted. We've been lucky so far, but luck doesn't last forever in combat. Are you recommending any changes to our tactics? I've submitted several proposals to Wing headquarters, but changes take time to implement. For now, we continue flying the missions we're assigned, and hope our luck holds out. Sarah nodded, understanding the difficult position that Bradley was in as a squadron commander. He had to balance mission accomplishment with pilot safety, and sometimes those two priorities conflicted. That evening, Sarah called her father again. She could not discuss operational details, but she needed to hear a familiar voice. How are you holding up, sweetheart? Her father asked. I'm doing well, Dad. Learning a lot. The work is challenging but rewarding. I can hear something in your voice. Are you getting enough rest? Sarah's father knew her well enough to detect the stress that she was trying to hide. I'm sleeping fine, just busy with work. Remember what I told you about trusting your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, don't ignore that feeling. Your subconscious often picks up on things before your conscious mind does. I'll remember that, Dad. After hanging up, Sarah thought about her father's words. Something had been bothering her about their recent missions, but she could not quite identify what it was. The enemy seemed to be anticipating their tactics more effectively than random chance would suggest. The next morning brought news that confirmed her suspicions. An F-15E Strike Eagle from another squadron had been shot down during a SCAD mission similar to the one Sarah had been flying. Both crew members were listed as missing in action. Intelligence believes the enemy may have developed new tactics for engaging our SCAD flights, Colonel Davis explained during the emergency briefing. All missions are suspended pending a tactical review. Sarah felt a mix of relief and frustration. The suspension of missions would give them time to develop safer tactics, but it also meant returning to the waiting and uncertainty that had characterized her training period. As she walked back to her quarters, Sarah realized that her real education as a combat pilot was just beginning. The enemy had revealed their hand, and now it was time for the Air Force to adapt. The next phase of operations would test not just her flying skills, but her ability to survive in an increasingly dangerous environment. Captain Sarah Chun stood in the intelligence briefing room, studying reconnaissance photographs spread across the table. 3 days had passed since the loss of the F-15E, and tension filled the air like smoke. Every pilot knew that their next mission could be their last if they did not figure out what had gone wrong. The wreckage was found here. Captain Walsh pointed to a spot on the satellite image, approximately 12 miles from the primary target. Crash analysis suggests the aircraft was hit by a surface-to-air missile, but not from the SA-20 site they were attacking. Major Bradley leaned forward, examining the photographs more closely. That would put the launch point somewhere in this area, he said, circling a region with his finger. But intelligence showed no missile systems in that location. That's correct. We're dealing with a mobile threat. The enemy is repositioning their systems more frequently than we anticipated, and they're coordinating their defensive efforts much more effectively. Sarah studied the terrain features in the photographs. Something about the crash location bothered her, but she could not immediately identify what was wrong. The F-15E had been flying a standard SCAD mission profile, similar to the one she had flown successfully multiple times. What was their ingress route, she asked. Captain Walsh traced a line on the map, showing the planned flight path. The route took the F-15E through a valley system that provided terrain masking, then up and over a ridgeline for the final attack on the missile site. They would have been completely exposed during the climb out of the valley, Sarah observed. If there was a mobile launcher positioned on this hilltop, it would have had a perfect shot. That's our working theory. The question is how the enemy knew to position a missile system at that exact location. The implications were troubling. Either the enemy had developed extremely good intelligence about American attack routes, or they had found a way to predict where attacking aircraft would be most vulnerable. Lieutenant Colonel Davis entered the briefing room carrying a classified message folder. His expression was grim. I just received new intelligence from the National Security Agency. Communications intercepts suggest that the enemy has been monitoring our radio transmissions and using that information to position their defenses. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If the enemy could intercept their communications, then every aspect of their mission planning was potentially compromised. Flight routes, target assignments, timing, even emergency procedures could all be known to the enemy before the missions began. How is that possible? Bradley asked. Our communications are encrypted. The encryption is strong, but not unbreakable. NSA believes the enemy has received technical assistance from a nation-state with advanced cyber capabilities. They may have acquired our encryption keys or developed methods to break our codes in real time. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Modern military operations depended heavily on secure communications. If that security had been compromised, then traditional tactics would need to be completely reconsidered. What are our options? Sarah asked. We're developing new communication protocols that will be much harder to intercept. But until those are ready, we'll have to operate under the assumption that the enemy can hear everything we say over the radio. Colonel Davis turned to a new page in his briefing folder. In the meantime, we have new mission requirements. Intelligence has identified a high-value target that takes priority over the SA-20 sites. There's a command and control facility that coordinates all enemy air defenses in this region. If we can destroy it, their defensive effectiveness should drop significantly. Captain Walsh replaced the previous photographs with new intelligence imagery showing a large compound surrounded by defensive positions. The facility is located in a mountainous region approximately 200 miles northeast of here. It's heavily defended with multiple missile systems and anti-aircraft guns. Sarah studied the target photographs. The compound looked formidable. It was positioned on high ground with clear fields of fire in all directions. Approaching aircraft would be visible for miles before reaching weapons release range. "What's the planned attack strategy?" Bradley asked. "That's where it gets complicated. Because of the communication security issue, we can't coordinate a large-scale attack using multiple aircraft. We need a small formation that can operate independently without radio communications." Colonel Davis looked directly at Sarah and Bradley. "You two will fly this mission together. Minimal radio contact, maximum operational flexibility. Your job is to penetrate the defenses and destroy the command facility." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This would be by far the most dangerous mission she had ever flown. A two-aircraft formation attacking a heavily defended target without the support of electronic warfare aircraft, suppression flights, or rescue assets. "When do we launch?" Bradley asked. "Tomorrow night. The attack will take place during a new moon for maximum darkness. You'll approach the target at low altitude using terrain masking, then climb for a high-speed bombing run." After the briefing, Sarah spent the afternoon studying every detail of the mission plan. The target was located in a valley surrounded by peaks that rose to over 8,000 feet. The approach would require precise navigation through mountainous terrain in complete darkness. The weapon's load would consist of 2 GBU, 10 laser-guided bombs per aircraft. The bombs were large enough to completely destroy the target, but they required the aircraft to maintain a stable flight path during the final attack phase. This made the attacking aircraft vulnerable to defensive fire. That evening, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She kept running through various scenarios in her mind, looking for potential problems or weaknesses in the plan. Every aspect of the mission carried significant risks. The next morning brought additional complications. Weather reports showed a storm system moving into the target area. Cloud cover would provide concealment for the attacking aircraft, but it would also make navigation more difficult and could interfere with the laser guidance systems on their bombs. "We could postpone until the weather clears," Bradley suggested during their final briefing. "Negative," Colonel Davis replied. "Intelligence indicates the enemy may be planning to relocate this facility. If we don't hit it tomorrow night, we may lose the opportunity entirely." Sarah understood the pressure to proceed with the mission despite the adverse conditions. Opportunities to strike high-value targets were rare and had to be exploited quickly. At 2,200 hours, Sarah and Bradley walked out to their aircraft. The base was unusually quiet. Most personnel were asleep, unaware that 2 pilots were about to attempt one of the most dangerous missions of the war. Sarah's F-16 had been loaded with maximum fuel and 2 large bombs. The aircraft was heavy and would be sluggish until some fuel was burned off. She would need to be especially careful during the low-altitude portions of the flight. "Phoenix, Hawk Leader. Radio check. Hawk Leader, Phoenix. 5x5. Roger. Remember, we maintain radio silence once we cross into enemy airspace. Stick with me no matter what happens." Phoenix copies. The takeoff was routine, but as soon as they became airborne, Sarah could see lightning flashing inside the clouds ahead. The weather was going to be worse than forecast. Flying through thunderstorms while carrying heavy bomb loads was dangerous under any circumstances. They climbed to cruise altitude and set course for the target area. The first hour of the flight was uneventful. They flew over friendly territory where the main threats were mechanical failure or mid-air collision. Both aircraft were operating normally with no signs of problems. As they approached enemy airspace, Bradley signaled for radio silence. From this point forward, they would communicate only through prearranged hand signals and flight maneuvers. Sarah checked her weapons systems one more time and prepared for the most challenging part of the mission. They descended to low altitude and began following their planned route through the mountains. Flying at night through mountainous terrain required constant attention to altitude and heading. The margin for error was measured in feet rather than miles. Sarah could see Bradley's aircraft ahead of her, barely visible against the dark landscape. She used her night vision goggles to maintain visual contact while monitoring her navigation systems. The GPS showed they were on course, but the storm clouds were making visibility increasingly poor. 30 minutes into enemy territory, they encountered their first defensive systems. Sarah's radar warning receiver began showing signals from search radars somewhere ahead. The enemy knew that aircraft were in the area, but they had not yet established an exact location. Bradley began a series of evasive maneuvers, weaving between mountain peaks to avoid radar detection. Sarah followed precisely, matching every turn and altitude change. They were now flying less than 500 feet above the ground at nearly 400 miles per hour. A bright flash lit up the sky ahead of them. Someone was firing surface-to-air missiles, but Sarah could not tell whether they were aimed at her formation or at some other target. The missiles streaked upward into the clouds and disappeared. They continued toward the target, climbing gradually as the terrain rose higher. Sarah could feel the aircraft struggling with the heavy bomb load and thin mountain air. Engine performance was reduced at this altitude, and the aircraft responded more slowly to control inputs. Bradley's aircraft suddenly banked sharply to the left. Sarah followed immediately, not knowing what threat he had detected. Through her night vision goggles, she could see tracers from anti-aircraft fire streaming past their position. Ground-based guns were shooting at them, though apparently without accurate targeting information. The target area came into view 10 minutes later. Sarah could see the compound clearly through her targeting system. It was exactly as shown in the intelligence photographs, but now it was surrounded by defensive fire. Missiles, tracers, and flak bursts filled the air above the facility. Bradley began his attack run, diving toward the target from the northwest. Sarah positioned herself to attack from a different angle, as they had planned. This would split the defensive fire and increase their chances of success. As she rolled in her dive, Sarah could see her target clearly in the bomb site. The laser guidance system was locked onto the primary building in the center of the compound. Everything was working perfectly, but the amount of defensive fire was incredible. A surface-to-air missile streaked past her aircraft, missing by less than 100 feet. Another missile exploded nearby, close enough to shake her aircraft with a blast wave. Sarah maintained her dive angle and airspeed, concentrating on delivering her bombs accurately. At the planned release point, she pressed the pickle button and felt the aircraft jump upward as the heavy bombs fell away. Immediately, she pulled into a sharp climbing turn to escape the target area as quickly as possible. Behind her, massive explosions lit up the compound as both sets of bombs found their targets. The primary building disappeared in a ball of fire, and secondary explosions indicated that ammunition or fuel storage areas had been hit. But the mission was far from over. They still had to escape through 200 miles of enemy territory to reach safety. And now the enemy would be fully alert to their presence. Sarah could see Bradley's aircraft ahead of her, but something was wrong. His aircraft was trailing what appeared to be fuel or hydraulic fluid. He had taken damage during the attack, though she could not tell how serious it was. Without radio communications, there was no way to determine Bradley's status or coordinate their escape route. Sarah could only follow his lead and hope that his aircraft would remain flyable until they reached friendly airspace. They descended back to low altitude and began the long journey home. The weather was getting worse, with rain and turbulence making flight increasingly difficult. Sarah had to constantly adjust her position to maintain visual contact with Bradley's aircraft. An hour into the return flight, Bradley's aircraft began losing altitude. Sarah could see that he was having difficulty maintaining level flight. His engine was probably damaged, reducing his power output and making it impossible to maintain normal flight parameters. Sarah moved closer to Bradley's aircraft, trying to determine the extent of his damage. In the dim light, she could see that his left wingtip was missing and there were holes in his fuselage. He had been hit by anti-aircraft fire during the attack. Bradley began a gradual descent toward a lower altitude. Sarah realized that he was preparing for an emergency landing, though finding a suitable landing site in mountainous terrain would be extremely difficult. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah could see a flat area that might be suitable for an emergency landing. It appeared to be a small valley with relatively level ground. She flew ahead of Bradley and used her aircraft's lights to mark what appeared to be the best approach path. Bradley's aircraft touched down hard and bounced twice before settling onto the rough ground. Sarah could see sparks flying from his landing gear and realized that his tires had probably blown out during the landing. But the aircraft came to a stop without catching fire. Sarah circled the landing site, trying to determine whether Bradley had survived the crash. After several minutes, she saw a figure climb out of the aircraft and wave. He was alive, but now he was stranded in enemy territory with no way to reach safety. Sarah had to make a decision. She could continue to home base and report Bradley's location so that a rescue mission could be organized, or she could attempt to land her own aircraft and try to extract Bradley herself. The rescue option was safer, but would take time. Bradley would be exposed and vulnerable on the ground for hours or days before a rescue team could reach him. The extraction option was much more dangerous, but would get Bradley to safety immediately. Looking at the rough landing site, Sarah realized that her aircraft might not be able to take off again even if she managed to land safely. The ground appeared soft and uneven. Her aircraft would likely become stuck or damaged during the landing attempt. But Bradley was her wingman and her responsibility. The decision was really no decision at all. Sarah lined up for an approach to the makeshift landing strip, knowing that she was probably ending her own chance of escape. Captain Sarah Chun reduced power and lowered her landing gear as she approached the rough valley floor, where Major Bradley's aircraft sat damaged and smoking. The makeshift landing strip looked even worse up close. Rocks, soft sand, and uneven terrain stretched across what she hoped would be enough distance to stop her F-16 without destroying it. Her hands were steady on the controls despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Every instinct told her that attempting to land here was suicide. The ground was too soft, too rough, too short for a fighter aircraft designed to operate from smooth runways. But leaving Bradley behind was not an option. The aircraft touched down hard, bouncing violently as the landing gear struck hidden rocks and soft patches of sand. Sarah fought to keep the nose straight as the aircraft decelerated rapidly. The anti-skid brakes worked overtime, preventing the wheels from locking up completely. She could feel the aircraft sinking into the soft ground as it slowed. The main gear was cutting deep grooves in the sandy soil. At 50 knots, the nose gear collapsed completely, sending the aircraft sliding forward on its belly in a shower of sparks and dirt. When motion finally stopped, Sarah sat in the cockpit for a moment, amazed to be alive. The aircraft was definitely not going to fly again, but the landing had been survivable. She shut down the engine quickly to prevent fire and began the emergency egress procedure. Bradley was running toward her aircraft as she climbed out of the cockpit. Even in the dim light, she could see that he was limping badly. His left arm hung at an awkward angle, probably broken during his own crash landing. "Phoenix, are you crazy? What the hell are you doing here? Couldn't leave my wingman behind, sir. How badly are you hurt?" Bradley reached her position, breathing heavily from the short run. "Broken arm, maybe some ribs. Nothing that'll kill me. But we're both in deep trouble now. This valley is going to be crawling with enemy patrols by sunrise." Sarah looked around at their surroundings. The valley was approximately 2 miles long and half a mile wide, surrounded by steep hills on all sides. There were several possible escape routes, but all of them would require climbing through difficult terrain while avoiding enemy search parties. "What's our best option?" she asked. Bradley pointed toward the eastern end of the valley. "There's a narrow canyon that leads toward friendly lines. It's about 15 miles through rough country, but it's our best chance. We need to move fast before they bring in helicopters and ground troops." Sarah gathered her survival gear from the aircraft. Water, emergency rations, first aid kit, radio beacon, and her sidearm. The radio beacon would allow rescue forces to locate them, but it would also reveal their position to enemy forces monitoring the same frequencies. "Should we activate the beacon?" "Not yet. Let's get some distance from the aircraft first. If they triangulate our position while we're still here, we'll be trapped." They began walking toward the eastern canyon, moving as quickly as Bradley's injuries would allow. Sarah took point, using her night vision goggles to navigate around obstacles and watch for threats. Bradley followed, trying to minimize noise despite his obvious pain. The terrain was worse than it had appeared from the air. Loose rocks shifted underfoot with every step. Thorny vegetation caught at their flight suits. Hidden crevices and washouts made progress slow and dangerous in the darkness. After an hour of hiking, they stopped to rest and assess their situation. Bradley was struggling with pain from his injuries, and both of them were already showing signs of dehydration in the dry mountain air. "How far do you think we've come?" Sarah asked quietly. "Maybe 2 miles. At this pace, it'll take us 8 hours to reach the canyon, assuming we don't run into any patrols." Sarah checked her watch. It was just after midnight. They had perhaps 4 hours of darkness remaining before sunrise would make concealment much more difficult. "We need to move faster," she said. "I know, but I'm slowing you down with these injuries. Maybe you should go ahead and try to reach friendly lines. Send back a rescue team for me." Sarah looked at Bradley's pale face in the dim starlight. He was clearly in significant pain, but he was also trying to give her the best chance of escape. "We stick together, sir. That's how this works." They resumed walking, pushing through fatigue and discomfort. The canyon entrance was still barely visible in the distance, seeming to get no closer despite their steady progress. Sarah began to worry that they would not reach cover before daybreak exposed them to enemy observation. 20 minutes later, they heard the first helicopter. The distinctive sound of rotor blades echoed off the valley walls, growing steadily louder. Someone was conducting a search operation, probably looking for the crews of the 2 crashed aircraft. "Get down," Bradley whispered. They dropped flat against the rocky ground as the helicopter passed overhead. Sarah could see navigation lights and a searchlight sweeping back and forth across the valley floor. The aircraft was flying a systematic search pattern, covering every possible hiding place. The searchlight beam passed within 50 feet of their position, close enough for Sarah to feel the downdraft from the rotor blades. But the helicopter continued without stopping, apparently not spotting them among the rocks and shadows. "Search and rescue are hostile?" Sarah asked. "Definitely hostile. Wrong type of aircraft and wrong flight pattern for a rescue mission." The helicopter completed its sweep of the valley and moved on to search other areas. But Sarah knew it would be back soon with additional aircraft. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the search effort intensified. They pushed forward with renewed urgency, ignoring pain and fatigue. The canyon entrance was getting closer, but sunrise was also approaching rapidly. If they were caught in open ground during daylight, their chances of survival would drop to nearly zero. As they reached the base of the hills surrounding the valley, Sarah heard voices in the distance. Someone was calling out in a language she did not recognize. Ground troops had arrived to join the search effort. "How many?" Bradley whispered. Sarah listened carefully to the voices. "Sounds like at least 6 or 8 people. They're spreading out to search the crash sites. They'll find the aircraft in a few minutes. When they do, they'll know we survived and start tracking us." They entered the narrow canyon just as the eastern horizon began showing the first hints of dawn. The walls rose steeply on both sides, providing good concealment, but also limiting escape options if they were trapped. The canyon floor was filled with loose rocks that shifted loudly underfoot. Every step seemed to echo off the walls, announcing their presence to anyone within hearing range. Sarah tried to find quieter routes through the debris, but progress was inevitably noisy. 2 hours into the canyon, they heard dogs barking in the distance. The enemy had brought in tracking animals to follow their trail. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized that their scent would be easy to follow through the confined space of the canyon. "How far to the end?" she asked. Bradley consulted the map he had been carrying. "At least 8 more miles." The canyon winds back and forth through the mountains before reaching the plateau on the other side. 8 miles through difficult terrain while being pursued by trained trackers and search dogs. Sarah calculated that they would need at least 4 hours to cover that distance, probably longer given Bradley's injuries. But the dogs would be much faster and would not tire as quickly as humans. "We need to do something about the dogs," Sarah said. Bradley nodded grimly. "The only way to stop tracking dogs is to eliminate the trail or eliminate the dogs. We can't eliminate our scent trail." So, Sarah understood what he was suggesting. They would have to turn and fight, using their weapons to stop the pursuit before it could close the distance. It was a dangerous gamble, but continuing to run was probably hopeless. They found a defensible position where the canyon narrowed between two large rock formations. Sarah positioned herself on one side, while Bradley took the other, despite his injuries. From these positions, they could cover the entire width of the canyon and catch any pursuers in a crossfire. The wait was agonizing. They could hear the dogs getting closer, their barking echoing off the canyon walls. Voices followed behind, shouting instructions and coordinates. Sarah estimated at least 12 people in the pursuit group, probably more. The first dog appeared around a bend in the canyon, followed closely by its handler. Sarah aimed carefully and fired once. The dog dropped immediately, and the handler dove for cover behind a boulder. Shouts of alarm echoed through the canyon as the pursuit team realized they had found their quarry. Bradley engaged a second dog and handler from his position across the canyon. The pursuing soldiers began returning fire, but their shots were poorly aimed and struck the canyon walls well above Sarah's position. For several minutes, the firefight continued with neither side able to gain an advantage. The enemy had superior numbers, but Sarah and Bradley held better defensive positions. The narrow canyon prevented the enemy from using their numerical advantage effectively. Sarah could hear radio chatter from the enemy positions. They were calling for reinforcements and possibly air support. If helicopters arrived, the defensive advantages of the canyon would disappear quickly. "We need to move," Bradley called out during a lull in the shooting. "Agreed. Can you travel?" "I'll have to." They withdrew from their positions and continued deeper into the canyon, moving as quickly as possible while watching for pursuit. The firefight had bought them time, but it had also confirmed their location to a much larger enemy force. The canyon began to climb steeply as it wound through the mountains. Sarah found herself breathing heavily in the thin air, and she could see that Bradley was struggling even more with his injuries and the altitude. Behind them, they could hear the pursuit resuming. More voices, more dogs, and the sound of helicopter rotor blades in the distance. The enemy was committing significant resources to capturing or killing them. There, Bradley pointed ahead to where the canyon walls opened into a broad valley. "That's the plateau. Friendly lines are about 5 miles beyond the rim. 5 miles of open ground under enemy observation." Sarah could see that the plateau offered little concealment. They would be completely exposed to air attack once they left the protection of the canyon walls. As they reached the canyon mouth, Sarah spotted movement in the valley ahead. Vehicles were positioned across their escape route. The enemy had anticipated their destination and moved ground forces to intercept them. "Roadblock," she reported. Bradley studied the enemy positions through his binoculars. "Looks like 3 or 4 vehicles, maybe 20 soldiers. They're positioned to cover all the approaches to the plateau rim." Sarah counted muzzle flashes and estimated enemy strength. The blocking force was substantial, but not overwhelming. With careful tactics, they might be able to fight through to reach friendly territory. "What's the plan?" she asked. Bradley was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical situation. "We wait for dark. Then we try to infiltrate through their positions. It's risky, but a frontal assault would be suicide. That's 8 hours. Can we hold off pursuit that long?" "We'll have to." They found concealed positions among the rocks near the canyon mouth and prepared for a long day of avoiding detection. Sarah distributed their remaining water and food, calculating that they had enough for perhaps 12 hours if they were careful. The helicopter appeared an hour later, conducting a systematic search of the canyon. Sarah pressed herself flat against the rocks as the aircraft passed directly overhead, its crew scanning for any sign of movement below. For the next several hours, they remained motionless while aircraft and ground patrols searched the area around them. Sarah lost count of the number of times enemy soldiers passed within a few hundred feet of their hiding place. By mid-afternoon, The search seemed to be moving away from their position. The enemy apparently believed they were still deeper in the canyon system, not realizing that their quarry had already reached the valley. "Tonight, we make our move," Bradley whispered. "One way or another, this is tonight." Sarah checked her remaining ammunition. She had 4 magazines for her pistol, plus whatever Bradley had for his weapon. Not much firepower for fighting through an enemy blocking position, but it would have to be enough. As darkness approached, Sarah prepared mentally for what was likely to be the most dangerous few hours of her life. Everything she had trained for, everything she had learned about combat and survival would be tested in the next few miles. She thought about her father and his experiences as a prisoner of war. He had survived 3 years in captivity through mental toughness and refusal to give up. She would need that same determination to survive the night ahead. "Ready?" Bradley asked, as full darkness settled over the valley. "Ready," Sarah replied. They began moving toward the enemy positions, knowing that failure meant capture or death, but also knowing that they had no choice but to fight.